I found my dead mother's diary in a gas station bathroom, and it led me to a mountain ranch I didn't know I owned, where someone had been living in secret for 20 years. Before I take you into this wild story, hit that subscribe button real quick. Tomorrow, I'm posting something that'll completely blow your mind about family secrets that change everything. I was 21 years old and sleeping in my car when everything changed. Not a nice car either. A 2003 Honda Civic with a broken passenger window I'd covered with duct tape and a trash bag. The back seat was my bedroom, piled with everything I owned: two duffel bags of clothes, a sleeping bag I'd bought at Goodwill, and a backpack with my important documents, which honestly wasn't much: birth certificate, social security card, and a high school diploma that hadn't done me any good. I'd been homeless for 6 months, ever since I aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. I spent my days working at a truck stop diner off Interstate 40, taking every shift they'd give me. The pay was terrible, but it came with one meal per shift and access to a bathroom where I could wash up and pretend I had my life together. Nights I spent in the Walmart parking lot or occasionally behind the diner itself when my manager Brenda looked the other way. It was a Wednesday morning in late October when I walked into the gas station across from the diner to use their bathroom before my shift. The place was empty except for a tired-looking clerk scrolling through his phone behind the register. I headed to the women's restroom, which was surprisingly clean for a truck stop gas station, and that's when I saw it. Sitting on the narrow shelf above the sink was a small leather journal, the kind with a strap that wraps around and buttons shut. Someone had obviously left it behind. My first instinct was to turn it in to the clerk, but something made me open it first. The handwriting inside was shaky, like whoever wrote it had unsteady hands. But it was the name on the first page that made my heart stop. Property of Diane Christine. If found, please return to Mountain View Ranch, Summit County, Colorado. Diane Christine. That was my mother's name. I'd never known my mother. She died when I was 3 days old, shortly after leaving me at a hospital in Kansas City. I'd spent my entire childhood in foster care, bouncing between homes, never adopted, never wanted for long. The only things I knew about my mother were her name, and that she died from complications after my birth. Nobody had ever mentioned anything about Colorado or a ranch. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The entries were dated, starting from 15 years ago and continuing sporadically over the years. The last entry was dated just 3 months ago. I can't keep running forever. One entry read, "The ranch was supposed to be my safe place, but I brought my problems with me. I just hope that someday my daughter will find this and know that I tried, that I loved her even though I couldn't keep her." Tears blurred my vision. My mother hadn't died when I was 3 days old. She'd lived. She'd been alive all these years, and nobody had told me. I kept reading, my shift completely forgotten. The entries painted a picture of a woman who'd been running from something, hiding in the mountains of Colorado on a ranch that had apparently been in her family. She wrote about her guilt over leaving me, her fear that whoever she was running from would find her, and her hope that I'd somehow have a better life without her. The most recent entry was brief. "I'm dying now, really dying this time. Pancreatic cancer. Maybe it's better this way. I'm leaving everything to her, to my Alexis, the ranch, the land, all of it. I made arrangements with Mr. Holloway. If she ever comes looking, he'll know what to do. I sat on that dirty bathroom floor, reading and rereading the journal until the clerk knocked on the door, asking if I was okay. I stuffed the journal into my backpack and stumbled out, my mind spinning with questions. I called in sick to work, the first time I'd ever missed a shift. Then I drove to the public library and spent the next 6 hours researching. I found an obituary for Diane Christine Morrison, aged 43, who'd passed away 3 months ago in Summit County, Colorado. Survived by one daughter, Alexis Grace Morrison, services private. That was me, Alexis Grace Morrison. I'd been named in her obituary. She'd acknowledged me, even though she'd never been part of my life. I found more information about Mountain View Ranch, a property in the Colorado mountains that had been owned by the Morrison family for 3 generations. The county records showed it as a 150-acre property with a main house, guest cabin, and barn. And according to the records, it had been transferred to my name 4 months ago. I owned a ranch, I owned property, and I'd had no idea. I spent my last paycheck on gas and drove for 14 hours straight from Kansas to Colorado. The address I'd found took me up a winding mountain road, past ski resort towns and scattered cabins, higher and higher, until my ears popped from the elevation. The Civic's engine struggled on the steep grades, coughing and wheezing. But it made it. Mountain View Ranch sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees and mountain peaks. The main house was a 2-story log structure with a green metal roof and a wide front porch. Behind it stood a smaller cabin and a red barn that looked like it had been there for 100 years. Everything was covered in a light dusting of early snow. I parked at the edge of the property, suddenly nervous. This was mine. All of this belonged to me. But it felt wrong, like I was trespassing on someone else's life. That's when I noticed the smoke. A thin line of gray rising from the main house's chimney. Someone was here. Someone was living in my house. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. The porch steps creaked under my weight. Before I could knock, the door opened, and I found myself face to face with a woman who could have been 50 or 70. It was impossible to tell. She had long silver hair, weathered skin, and eyes that were startlingly blue. "You must be Alexis," she said, as if she'd been expecting me. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, mouth open, trying to process how this stranger knew my name. "I'm Margaret," she continued. "I've been taking care of the place. Your mother asked me to stay until you came. Honestly, I wasn't sure you ever would." "I just found out about any of this yesterday," I managed to say. "I found her journal in a gas station bathroom." Margaret's expression softened. "That sounds like something Diane would do. She was always leaving pieces of herself in unexpected places, hoping someone would find them. Come inside. You must be exhausted." The interior of the house was warm and cozy, with wood-paneled walls covered in photographs and artwork. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and the smell of coffee filled the air. It looked lived in and loved, nothing like I'd expected from an abandoned property. Margaret poured me coffee, and we sat at a heavy wooden table that looked handmade. "Your mother and I were friends for 15 years, she began. "I met her when she first came to Summit County, scared and pregnant and running from something she never fully explained. I owned the property next door, and we became close. When she got sick, She made me promise to keep the ranch going until you came to claim it. Why didn't anyone tell me she was alive? I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since I'd found the journal. She thought she was protecting you, Margaret said. Whoever your father was, she was terrified of him. She believed that if he knew she had a daughter, he'd use you to get to her, or worse. So she gave you up, told everyone she'd died, and disappeared into these mountains. It wasn't right, and I told her so many times. But fear makes people do irrational things. I learned that my mother had lived quietly on the ranch, barely leaving the property, supporting herself with remote work and the small inheritance from her own parents that had bought the land. Margaret had been her only real friend, her connection to the outside world. She followed your life as best she could, Margaret said. She knew you were in foster care. It ate at her every single day. But she convinced herself you were safer without her, that her presence would only bring danger to you. And now? I asked. What about the danger now? Margaret shrugged. Honestly, I think most of it was in her head by the end. She'd been running so long, she didn't know how to stop. But she wanted you to have this place, to have something solid and real. She spent her last months getting everything in order, working with a lawyer named Thomas Holloway to make sure the property transferred to you cleanly. I spent that first night in the guest cabin, unable to sleep in the main house that my mother had occupied. Margaret had kept everything exactly as Diane had left it, and walking through those rooms felt like touring a museum of a life I should have known, but didn't. Over the next few days, Margaret showed me the property. The 150 acres included meadows, forest, and a small creek that ran year-round. My mother had kept chickens and a vegetable garden. The barn housed an old truck, some basic farm equipment, and endless boxes of my mother's belongings that I wasn't ready to face yet. What were you planning to do? I asked Margaret one evening as we fed the chickens together. Were you just going to stay here forever waiting for me? She smiled. I didn't mind. I sold my own property 2 years ago and moved into the cabin here. Diane and I had become family. This place felt more like home than anywhere else. But it's your home now, Alexis. You get to decide what happens next. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you hit that subscribe button. The next morning, I finally went through my mother's things. In her bedroom closet, I found boxes labeled with my name. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, pictures of me as a baby in the foster system, school photos from kindergarten through 12th grade, even a few candid shots that someone must have taken and sent to her. She documented my entire childhood from a distance, watching me grow up through stolen glimpses. There were also letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me but never sent. I sat on her bed and read them one by one, tears streaming down my face. Dear Alexis, one began, you turned 5 today. I wonder if you had a birthday party. I hope someone made you a cake and sang to you. I baked a cake here and sang to you alone in this kitchen, pretending you could hear me. I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm so sorry. Another from when I was 12. You're probably dealing with all the complicated feelings that come with being your age. I wish I could tell you that it gets easier, that you'll find where you belong. This ranch was my place to belong, and I hope someday it can be yours too. The final letter was written just days before she died. My dearest Alexis, if you're reading this, then you found your way here. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day passed that I didn't regret it. This land is yours now. Do with it whatever brings you peace. If that means selling it and never thinking of me again, I understand. But if you choose to stay, know that you're standing where I stood, breathing the same mountain air, and maybe that's the closest we'll ever get to being together. I love you. I always have. I cried until I had no tears left, curled up on my mother's bed, surrounded by evidence of a love I'd never gotten to experience directly. Margaret found me there hours later. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me and held my hand until I could breathe normally again. She was sick for a long time before the diagnosis, Margaret said quietly. Depression, anxiety, maybe PTSD from whatever she was running from. But she loved you fiercely. Everything she did, even the things that hurt you, came from that love. It doesn't make it right, but it's the truth. Over the following weeks, I settled into life at the ranch. I had nowhere else to go, no other plan, so I stayed. Margaret taught me how to care for the chickens, how to split firewood, how to prepare the property for the harsh mountain winter that was coming. She told me stories about my mother, painting a picture of a complicated woman who'd been both incredibly strong and deeply damaged. I met Thomas Holloway, the lawyer who'd handled my mother's estate. He explained that she'd left me not just the property, but also a small savings account with about $30,000, money she'd carefully set aside over the years. Your mother was very specific about her wishes, he said. She wanted to make sure you had options. You can sell the ranch if you want. The market for mountain properties is strong. Or you can keep it and build whatever life you want here. The choice is entirely yours. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized I didn't want to sell. For the first time in my life, I had a place that was truly mine. Not a foster home where I was temporary, not a car in a parking lot, but land and walls and a history that belonged to me. I discovered that my mother had been an artist. The house was filled with her paintings, mostly mountain landscapes and wildlife scenes, surprisingly good. Margaret told me she'd sold a few pieces in local galleries under a pseudonym, enough to supplement her income. I found myself picking up her brushes, trying my hand at painting. I had no formal training, but something about the act of creating felt right, like I was connecting with a part of her I'd never known. My early attempts were terrible, but Margaret encouraged me to keep going. Your mother didn't start out good either, she said. She taught herself by doing it over and over. Talent is just another word for persistent practice. I also started writing in the journal I'd found, continuing where my mother had left off. I wrote about my feelings, my confusion, my anger at the years we'd lost, and my gratitude for what she'd left behind. Writing helped me process everything, gave me a way to talk to her even though she was gone. One afternoon in early December, I was exploring the barn when I found a locked trunk pushed into a back corner. Margaret didn't have a key, so I jimmied the lock open with a screwdriver, curious about what my mother had felt was important enough to lock away. Inside were documents, legal papers, and newspaper clippings that made my blood run cold. The clippings were about a man named Richard Bartlett, a wealthy businessman in Kansas City who'd been investigated for domestic violence, stalking, and harassment of multiple women. The articles were dated from about 22 years ago. There were also court documents, restraining orders filed by my mother against Richard Bartlett. And there, at the bottom of the trunk, was a birth certificate. My birth certificate. In the space for father's name, it said Richard Michael Bartlett. My father wasn't just someone my mother had been afraid of. He was a documented abuser who'd terrorized her to the point that she'd fled across the country and hidden in the mountains. I showed everything to Margaret, who looked grave. She never told me his name, she said, but this explained so much about her fear. Men like that don't let go easily. Is he still alive? I asked, dreading the answer. Margaret helped me search online. We found Richard Bartlett's obituary from 8 years ago. He died in a car accident, and according to the article, he'd never married and had no children listed as survivors. My mother had spent 15 years hiding from a man who'd been dead for 8 of them. The tragedy of it hit me like a wave. She could have reached out to me, could have tried to build a relationship, but she'd died, never knowing she was finally safe. She didn't know, I whispered. She lived in fear all that time, and she didn't know he was dead. Margaret wrapped her arms around me. I think part of her didn't want to know. The fear had become her normal. Some people live in cages so long they don't know how to leave even when the door opens. But there was something else in the trunk, something that shifted the story once again. At the very bottom was a small wooden box, and inside was a flash drive with a label that said, "For Alexis, play this." I took it inside and plugged it into Margaret's laptop. The file was a video, and when I pressed play, my mother's face filled the screen. She looked older than in the photographs I'd found, thinner, her skin pale in a way that suggested this had been recorded near the end. But her eyes were clear and focused as she looked into the camera. "Hi, baby," she said, and her voice cracked. "If you're watching this, then you found everything. You know who I was and why I did what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to understand." She talked for 23 minutes, telling me her story. How she'd met my father when she was young and thought his intensity was love. How his control had gradually tightened until she was trapped, isolated from family and friends. How she'd gotten pregnant with me and known she had to escape before he destroyed both of us. "I couldn't take you with me," she explained, tears streaming down her face. "He would have found us. He had resources, connections, and he'd made it very clear that if I left, he'd hunt me down. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made everyone believe I died. I left you somewhere safe, where the system would protect you, and I disappeared." She talked about the guilt, the sleepless nights, the constant temptation to check on me in person. "But I couldn't risk it," she said. "One mistake, one person recognizing me, and he would have known. He would have used you to get to me, or worse, he would have taken you for himself just to hurt me. I couldn't let that happen." Near the end of the video, her expression changed, became more urgent. "I'm telling you all this because I need you to know something important. You're not defined by where you came from. Not by me, not by him, not by the system that raised you. This ranch, this land, it's been in our family for 3 generations on my mother's side. It represents something good, something solid. It's yours now, and you can use it to build whatever life you choose." She leaned closer to the camera. I wasn't a perfect mother. I wasn't any kind of mother at all, really. But I loved you with everything I had, even from a distance. And if there's any justice in the universe, you'll take this place and make it something beautiful. You'll have the life I couldn't give you. That's all I ever wanted. The video ended with her reaching toward the camera, her hand filling the screen for a moment before it cut to black. I sat in silence for a long time after it finished, Margaret beside me holding my hand. I'd spent my whole life believing I'd been unwanted, that my mother had abandoned me because I wasn't worth keeping. But the truth was so much more complicated. She'd given me up because she loved me, because keeping me would have meant exposing me to danger she couldn't protect me from. It didn't erase the years of loneliness and feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, but it reframed them, gave them context and meaning I'd never had before. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked gently. I looked around the warm cabin, thought about the land outside, the mountains rising in the distance, the life my mother had built here in hiding. "I'm going to stay," I said. "I'm going to make this place my home. Actually, my home, not just property I inherited. And I'm going to figure out who Alexis Morrison is when she's not running or hiding or just surviving." Over the next several months, I did exactly that. I officially moved into the main house, slowly making it my own while keeping elements of my mother's presence. I hung her paintings but added my own attempts beside them, creating a visual conversation between her artistic vision and my developing one. I used some of the money she'd left to take online courses in art and business, figuring out how to potentially turn creativity into income. Margaret connected me with the galleries that had sold my mother's work, and I started showing them my paintings under my own name. They weren't masterpieces, but a few sold, enough to give me confidence that I might be able to support myself this way eventually. I also started volunteering with a local organization that helped foster youth transition to independence. I knew that life, knew the fear and uncertainty, and I wanted to offer the kind of support I'd never had. Some of the kids I worked with reminded me so much of myself, guarded and tough on the outside while terrified and lost on the inside. One girl in particular, Maya, was 17 and about to age out with nowhere to go. She was smart and creative, but convinced the world had nothing good waiting for her. I hired her to help around the ranch in exchange for room and board in the guest cabin, giving her a safe place to land while she figured out her next steps. Margaret approved. "Your mother would have loved this," she said, "seeing you use this place to help others." Spring came to the mountains, the snow melting to reveal wildflowers and green meadows. I planted a garden, following the layout my mother had used, adding vegetables and herbs. The chickens laid eggs, and I learned to bake bread using Margaret's grandmother's recipe. Life took on a rhythm that felt sustainable and real. I painted a series of pieces about foster care, childhood, and belonging. They were raw and emotional, nothing like the pretty landscapes my mother had done, but they felt true. A gallery in Denver took 3 of them on consignment, and all 3 sold within a month. The gallery owner wanted more, wanted to do a whole show featuring my work. "You have something unique," she told me over the phone. "There's real pain in these pieces, but also hope. People respond to that authenticity." By the time summer arrived, I'd been living at Mountain View Ranch for 9 months. The scared, homeless girl who'd found a journal in a gas station bathroom felt like a different person. I'd gained weight in a healthy way, my cheeks filling out and color returning to my skin. My hands were strong from ranch work, my mind clearer from finally having stability and purpose. Maya had enrolled in community college and was talking about becoming a social worker. "Because of you," she said. "You showed me that the system doesn't have to define your whole life. You can write a different story." On what would have been my mother's 44th birthday, I hiked to the highest point on the property, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire ranch and the valley beyond. I brought her ashes, which Thomas Holloway had been holding and which I'd finally felt ready to scatter. As I released them into the mountain wind, I spoke to her one last time. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for loving me the only way you knew how. Thank you for being strong enough to let me go and smart enough to leave me something to come back to. I forgive you for all of it, and I hope wherever you are, you're finally free from the fear. You're finally free." The ashes caught the sunlight as they scattered, sparkling like snow, before disappearing into the landscape she'd loved. I stood there for a long time, crying and laughing and feeling more at peace than I'd ever felt in my life. I wasn't homeless anymore. I wasn't just surviving. I had a home, a history, and a future I was actively building. The mountain ranch my mother had left me wasn't just property. It was possibility. It was proof that even the most broken beginnings could lead somewhere beautiful if you were brave enough to keep going. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. We share stories about unexpected journeys, family secrets, and finding home in unexpected places. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever discovered something about your past that completely changed how you saw yourself? Have you found your own version of Mountain View Ranch, a place or truth that gave you belonging? Share your story with us. And before you go, make sure to click on one of the 2 stories on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. Until next time, remember that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you finally stop running.